You know, when I was first starting to draw and paint, I had a lot of trouble with the eye, and I think I'm not alone there. And it's true, the eye is a complex part of the head, probably the most complex part. However, it's not complex because any one part is necessarily harder to draw than any other part. It's the fact that the eye is made of so many little individual elements. Like we have the eyeball, you know, the spherical part of the eye that sits behind the eyelids. We have the eyelids themselves, an upper eyelid, a lower eyelid, each of which consists of their own series of planes. We have the tear duct area, which connects the two of them. Not to mention the fact that the whole assembly is kind of seated inside the eye socket. Remember in the brow section, we started to carve out this the eye socket, you know, that kind of hole in our skull that kind of goes in. Well, we got to figure that out. And then we have to figure out how that recess starts coming back out to meet the cheekbone. The eye kind of sits inside all of that madness. So it is a complex element in terms of how it's placed and, you know, perspective and how it's drawn. You know, things like the eyelids have their own planes and they're very box-like. We have a side plane here, we have a front plane here, we have another side plane here. So there are very manageable elements. We just have to break it down into a system. The thing I like about the eye is it links up and articulates with the side plane of the nose, sort of where the side plane of the nose ends, the front plane of the eye begins. So that'll help us. Also, there's this one other element, this overhanging element right here. You can imagine like an eyebrow would be sort of sitting right here, right? Well, underneath that eyebrow, it doesn't just change to the eye structure. There is this kind of shelf-like overhang that we have to deal with. So that shelf overhang sort of overlaps the upper eyelid to a certain degree. So we'll look at all that, and we really got a lot of stuff to break down with the eye. This will be the longest chapter in the entire lesson. But I'm confident that we can break it down into a digestible series of things that you can easily begin to draw on your own. So let's not wait any longer. Let's get right down to it. So let's start with the part of the eye that probably everyone wants to draw first, and that is the opening between the two eyelids. A quick little construction tip. Start by thinking of a rectangle. Now redraw that, but tilted on an axis like this. Then the only thing I want to do to that is kind of erase this out and put a little hook-like shape in there for the tear duct. And this is a good starting point for the opening. Of course, the iris would be somewhere in here. And we'll talk about the eyeball, the tear duct, the eyelids, which get built on top of this. But this is a great little starting point. Now, don't think I'm letting you off the hook that easily. The eye has a series of planes, of course. It is a three-dimensional object. Ironically, that's something that people commonly forget about the eye. This is a close-up of the Asaro head. To retrace what we just did, we have this box tilted on its axis, like that, with the tear duct shape as kind of sort of an end extension piece, you might call it. Now, this is probably very obvious, but let's point out that inside the eye is a round eyeball, which is literally a ball that sits inside the eye socket. It's actually a little bit smaller than that, something like this. And those eyelids that we just drew, that slanted box, goes around it, both at the top and around it at the bottom. And it does so in a series of planes. 4 planes to be exact. This flat plane here, 1, 2, which is this plane that is heavily tilted in perspective. 3, this large flat plane at the front. And 4, this plane that tapers off in perspective to the side. So again, this one tapers forward in perspective, and that one tapers around. So you get this overall round rhythm to the eye as those eyelids wrap around the eyeball. And of course, the same planes are represented down here, roughly in a mirror-like fashion. If I were to just draw the borders between these planes, it's like this. Okay. So going back to our slanted box diagram with the tear duct shape in here, let's identify the planes that this graphic shape represents. Here is this plane, here is this plane, and then it's hard to see from a front view because it's not such a big change from a front view, but we have this other plane. Let me draw this in black so we can see it more clearly. Here's this plane coming down, and this plane wraps around, and we have the same series of planes here. And if we want to just cross-contour them, just to help us understand the flow and orientation of the form, we can do that here. Okay, before I move on from here, just a couple of important pointers. If you were to draw a center line across the eye, the corners would not line up perfectly. The tear duct is a little bit higher than the corner on the other side. You'll notice my horizontal line is intersecting somewhere along the lower eyelid there, just a little bit lower than the exact corner. This is something that, again, changes from person to person, but in general, you'll get this kind of thing where the corners don't precisely line up. The eye dips just a little bit lower on the right side, or on the far side, I should say, because this would, of course, be the left side on the other side of the face. Good. Now, the iris usually sits high. It's not something that takes up the entire eye usually. Usually it sits a little bit above the center line, and we'll just throw it into a value just for this quick diagram. It is often overlapped right in here by the upper eyelid. Now let's figure out where the eyeball sits here. The outer edge of the eyeball is right here. It does not interfere with the tear duct. The tear duct is its own bit of tissue. It's called the caruncula, but the eyeball falls outside of it like this. The other edge of the eyeball is roughly in line with where, the edge of the eyelids are. And I just want to remind you that the eyeball is a sphere. Well, it's actually not a perfect sphere, but it's spherical. It's very close to a perfect sphere. And it also has, planes. It falls into light and shadow as well. So sometimes when you paint the eye, you can see this sort of shadow effect happening here. Also, oftentimes the upper eyelid, if the light is coming from above, the upper eyelid casts a shadow onto the eyeball, which is something that a lot of people miss as well. I think this often goes overlooked because there is thickness here. Even in this straight-on view, can you see that there is a thickness happening along the underside of the lid? It's not a paper-thin thing. You can see it much better in the lower lid. See this thickness? It's like a shelf that protrudes out, and there is thickness here, and it follows these planes. Same with the tear duct. There's a thickness to it. So just to quickly readdress our diagram here, there is a thickness that should be apparent in our diagram, which I'll just quickly indicate. We'll do more drawings to make this more clear. But just to complete this, let's throw these side planes in shadow. You can probably throw these planes in shadow as well, just because they also are turning. But we'll leave the tear duct planes not in shadow because they are flattening out again. Now we are getting somewhere. Quick little handy note here, the thickness of the tear duct, which is like this, right? This area in here, basically lines up or shares a border edge with the side plane of the nose. Remember how the side plane of the nose went out and in and up? Well, this little hook area right in here is the same contour as the tear duct. We go straight in from the side plane of the nose into the structure of the eye. Speaking of structure, it's critical to remember that the eye is a three-dimensional structure. That becomes extremely important when you're showing the eye from any kind of three-quarter angle like this. Let's bring back our straight-on diagram. You notice that in this view, it's this top plane right in here that forms the contour in this three-quarter view. The bottom plane is a bit softer. You can still see evidence of this plane, although it's very foreshortened right in there. And this plane still is noticeable to the camera. Also in this view, we can really get a respect for that thickness that occurs underneath the upper eyelid. And I don't think I've said this outright, but this is the upper eyelid, this area here, this series of planes, and this is the lower eyelid. I think that's obvious, but I should make sure I say it. So we've covered the upper eyelid, the lower eyelid, the tear duct that kind of connects them, the eyeball itself. But we're in this three-quarter view, which changes our drawing pretty dramatically. So what I like to do is think about the eyeball, and remember that upper eyelid is now coming around the form. The tear duct is still visible in a three-quarter view, but it's much foreshortened, so it appears, somewhere in there, which then branches out into our lower eyelid, which again goes around the form. And I find it helpful to draw the contour of the eyeball itself, which helps me find the thickness of the plane, the underside of the eyelid, which helps me then find the top of the upper eyelid, this line right here. And then I can find the corners of the planes. The upper eyelid, by the way, extends further beyond the eye, like this. Now let's go for the thickness of the lower eyelid. Now we can get the planes themselves, the front planes of the lower lid, something like that. Let's get this plane figured out. throw a quick value on there to indicate which planes turn under, which we've been commonly doing throughout this series. Also planes that heavily change direction, like the side planes here, we can throw these into shadow, just to get an understanding of the three-dimensional depth occurring here. Let's get a little center line for the eyeball. And because we're in perspective, the iris becomes an ellipse. A circle in perspective becomes an ellipse. So we have this kind of thing. Remember, the iris sits above center. Let's just throw it into a value. Let's get the thickness of the tear duct plane in here. And there we go. We can throw some of the eye into shadow here, which is a common thing. And if you want to exaggerate these prominent front planes of the eyelid, we can, put some white there. Also, some light value for the top plane of the lower eyelid. Because this plane points up, much like we did with the cheekbones that also pointed up, we can represent that plane change with a lighter value. And we'll throw the side of the eye into shadow just to remind ourselves that it is a ball, a three-dimensional spherical object sitting just behind the upper and lower eyelids. As usual, it very much helps to draw center lines or cross contours around the form so we fully understand what we're dealing with here. Here's another one over here just going along the form, out and in. Just, getting the thickness of things, making sure that we understand what it is we're drawing on a form level. So let's just do one more on this side. Get that thickness, roundness of the eyeball, thickness, and down. Kind of like a laser scan or something. Let's now look at the profile view of the eye. I'll bring in this Andrew Loomis diagram as well. And one of the first things that's very important to note is that there is this angle, this kind of stepping back angle to the eye when seen in profile. It's not straight up and down. This is another very common error in profile view drawings and paintings of the face. Much like our previous drawing, the contour right here is still this line, like the line of that plane. It's just this plane is foreshortened now. It appears narrower in perspective. And by comparison, we get a full view of the side plane, which in our first drawing right here was very foreshortened because we were looking at it from the front. All right, so to quickly just block in a drawing here, I like to sort of get that overall angle first. Let's remember to start with sort of an overall eyeball. Ever important to remember that the lids wrap around the ball. So I'm getting that here. The eyeball coming out, and then that lower lid wrapping around the eye. We know that the upper lid extends further, which we can really see from a side view, profile view. Let's get this plane, get that thickness. Make sure we get the thickness of the lower lid as well, as it is like this big shelf that exists. And the closer you look at the eye, the more you can see the thickness of that shelf. And then that goes down. We have our other plane here, and that plane wraps underneath the upper lid. Now, to get technical here, there is a slight protrusion that the cornea makes. The ball of the eye comes out a little bit. It's more like this kind of action. This is something that is not evident from a distance, but if just to be technical about it, there is this slight protrusion. It's kind of spherical in nature, like this. The iris itself sits behind that. Again, you will not see this from any kind of distance. And because it's pretty rare to paint the eye this close up in an actual illustration, you probably won't have to deal with that, but it is there. Okay, let's figure out the rest of our planes. Top plane, I always go too far on that plane. Let's just erase that out. And then down for the side of the eye, capitulating here. Important to note, you cannot see the tear duct in profile view. It exists back here. It's hidden by the three-dimensional form of the eyeball. You just connect these bottom planes, and like we always do, let's just throw some values in there. Casting a shadow over the eye. Let's get the side planes into some kind of tone, and just get the spherical nature of that eyeball. And here's that center line of the eye. And yeah, just to be fully diligent, let's get our cross contours in there. Just a few of them. And I feel like this is probably as good a time as any to talk about eyelashes, specifically where they sprout from. And that is, they sprout from the outer edge of both the upper eyelid and the lower eyelid. This edge here. Let me draw it on this diagram here. From this outer edge. And for the lower eyelid, the eyelashes sprout from this outer edge. So it's the outer edge of both. Now the actual hair growth and length and thickness obviously will vary dramatically from person to person. But one thing to keep in mind is that naturally, the eyelashes from the upper eyelid are thicker, perhaps to shield our eyeballs from the sun, I'm not sure. And they kind of follow they kind of flow with the form. And the lower eyelashes are thinner and, a little bit more sparse. And they also, their direction changes with the plane. So if we were to apply that to this one, the upper eyelashes are thicker and their direction sort of follows the direction of the plane that they're sprouting from. You often get a lot of thickness in this corner of the eye here. And then from the outer edge of the bottom lid, just try and get some kind of variety in the spacing. But more importantly, just look at the model that you're drawing or the character type you're designing, and that will determine how you treat the eyelashes themselves. Okay, next up on our grand tour of the eye, look at this monster right here. Look at those planes. We have not accounted for those planes yet. If you remember the brow lesson, we were doing drawings like this where we just had this hard line right there. But let's now add to that because there is a considerable thickness that happens here. And I consider this thickness part of the eye because it's very related to how you draw the eye and how the eye actually appears. The thing about this plane, the one simple truth, is that it lies in front of the eyelids and the eyeball and overhangs it. It's got a bottom thickness to it as well. If we just shoot a few vertical lines down, look how far it overhangs the eye. This is probably a good time to remind you that the eyeball sits inside the eye socket. It is buried deep within our skull. Well, maybe not so deep, but it's buried inside the skull. Just to roughly sketch it in, it's kind of like this sort of thing. We have the planes running down. I'm just going to do a quick drawing of this. Something in this range here, it's inset. The top edge of the brow that we learned in the brow section was here. But now we're dealing with this plane that comes down from that part of the brow, overhanging the eye. And as it does so, it partially obscures the upper eyelid. And just to throw this in value, it often also causes an entire darkening area here, which we'll talk more about in the actual painting section of this class. Also, while I'm on this diagram, remember that when we did those brow drawings, we were scooping out the brow like this. Like we had that plane that just cuts in like this when we're doing the brow. Just to make this clearer, I'll bring up one of our old drawings. Yeah, we had this scooping action as the eye socket is basically a hole in the skull. And then as that hole comes back because of the zygomatic bone, we have that, returning action, like a big scoop, right? Well, the eye itself occupies both the area that goes in and the area that comes out. The upper lid lies on the area that's going in, and then the lower lid will lie on the area that starts scooping back out. Okay, now we can start figuring out this kind of overhanging plane that I'm saying is largely part of the eye structure. Let's take a look at some photographs. Okay, so when you look at this, you should clearly recognize the upper eyelid that we just talked about. We're looking now at this big behemoth here. It's a very large plane. I've already said that it overlaps the upper eyelid, and it does so the most prominently along this plane here, which corresponding to the photo is this plane right in here. Can you see that area? That is where this flap of skin is the most prominent. You can literally see it cutting off the eyelid in this area. Like if I were to trace the upper eyelid, it would go underneath that flap of skin and then come back down. The contour of the eyelid kind of reveals itself maybe in that area there. But largely, when you're drawing eyes, the contour of this part is not going to be the upper eyelid, but it's going to be determined by this overhanging fold. If I were just to trace the plane of that fold, this being the underside now, when we get up into this region here, this area here, it becomes less flappy, and we can see the upper eyelid a lot more clearly. Again, the overhanging takes place mostly in this overall region here. This ridge is so significant that even when the head is tilted just a little bit down, this head here is looking just a little bit down, this big flappy plane here overlaps the eye significantly. Look at this. It's cutting off the entire upper lid, except for this area right in here. We can see the upper lid there, and we can see the upper lid coming down to meet the tear duct right in there. But this broad region right here is completely overtaken by that plane. And of course, same thing on the other side, is this nice straight that comes down. And again, it kind of allows that side plane of the upper eyelid to reveal itself right there. Also down in here where the tear duct is, you can see that upper eyelid plane. This is why I'm including this plane as part of the eye chapter instead of the brow chapter, because I think it impacts the eyes much more significantly than it does the brow. Oftentimes when I draw the eye from this angle, I'll start with that flappy plane, then work my way down to the tear duct, get the wrapping of the lower lid, find where the upper eyelid reveals itself right around this area, then it sneaks back underneath this overhanging plane here. While we're here, let's just find the thickness of that lower lid. And then, like I pointed out, it overlaps the eye so significantly that the iris is partially buried underneath it. And just for completion, let's get the corner of the eyeball here. And we can also maybe find the thickness of the tear duct plane right in here. Depending on the lighting, it's not uncommon at all for this to be entirely cast in shadow. Yeah, and then for the sake of completion, let's just get our lower planes blocked in here. And while I'm here, because we know that the upper eyelid is being overlapped, the eyebrow hairs just kind of protrude out from underneath here. Kind of a strange angle because we're looking down at the head. And then the lower eyelid, you know, the hairs will be protruding from that outer plane here. And remember, there is a great degree of thickness to these planes. The eyebrow itself grows along that thickness, somewhere in here. This is the point we were ballparking on the brow, that big change of direction. The eyebrow will change direction there and come down the other side in accordance with the form that it's following. And you know, there we go. That's a pretty complete study of the planes of the eye from this angle. Remember, the plane overhangs the most in this region. That means as the eyebrow moves away from the nose, which of course is the opposite way on this side of the face, as the eyebrow moves away from the nose, you're going to get that plane looking thicker as the overlap of it increases in this area and in this area. The particular amount of overlap on this model is a bit less than what we just saw previous. That is, you can see a pretty complete set of planes for the upper eyelid here. Perhaps it's buried just a little bit here, hard to tell, but it's certainly less than what we saw before. And it bears repeating that this is something that changes from person to person, so watch out for differences here. Let's try a study based on the outer eye this time. I'll start with the eyebrow itself, and what I'll do is I'll block in the change of plane that we looked at with the brow section. This is where the brow changes direction here. I'll get the overall sense of this eyebrow, which is very evenly thick, which is nice. Now I'm going to get that overlapping plane. Trying to block in the planes here. Looks like that's the front of it. Thins itself out over here. And remember, it's got some thickness at the bottom, which we can see in this view. Just a little bit of that, another kind of shelf thickness at the bottom. Now the upper eyelid comes out from underneath it, maybe roughly around there. It comes around and down to the tear duct region here. I'm of course imagining the eyeball, which is nice because now we know that the upper eyelid has to overlap it like this. The lower eyelid wraps around it as well. Make sure you get that thickness of it. It's always helpful to carve out some of these planes of the eyelid itself and just be accountable to all that structural information that we're working so hard to obtain. The eyelids are really thick on her, so they're obscuring a lot of the information here, which can play to our favor. So if we start throwing in some eyelashes here, keeping the thickness concentrated on the outer side of the eyelashes thin out when they approach the tear duct side of the eye. Same with the eyelashes that sprout from the lower lid. Just going to adjust my outer contour line here. Get the thickness of that upper eyelid. Just going to pronounce that a little bit more. And then her iris is kind of doing this, leaving just a little bit of negative space to the right of it, and I'll throw this in a value. Speaking of value, what I can do is I can get the entire upper eyelid to be in shadow, just to enforce the fact that it's being overhanged by the planes above it. I'm just going to throw the planes of the lower lid into shadow as well, and cast a bit of a shadow over the eyeball itself. Just make a few general tweaks. Maybe throw the top plane of the lower lid in a little bit of light. Oftentimes that lid does catch a little bit of a highlight. I'm not trying to copy the lighting in the photo, by the way. Again, all value stuff, like fine-tuned painting stuff, will be reserved for the second section of this whole class. Right now, I'm just using values to delineate, if something is turning or if something is being overhanged by something else. For instance, this plane here turns, so maybe you can throw it into shadow. The eyeball itself turns around there, so we can maybe throw that into shadow. And oftentimes, although it's hard to see on this photo, the pupil, which lies right in the middle of the iris, can often be even darker, providing just a slight darker passage here. And okay. And I think it's important to point out that the plane essentially ends along with the brow, like where those planes of the brow ended. The end of this overlapping, piece of geometry we're talking about here coincides, right here with where the brow also terminated. So yeah, this series of planes is very much a part of the brow, But again, putting it in the eye section because this upper contour is so influenced by this overhang. But you're asking, what about the Asian eye? What is it about the Asian eye that makes it look different from the Caucasian eye? Well, it's based on the same structure. That is, this overhang is still here. The big difference, however, is how that overhang terminates. It has a much broader influence. The anatomical name for this is the epicanthic fold, and it obscures either all of the upper eyelid or a large chunk of the upper eyelid. On this model, we can see the upper eyelid right in here. Essentially what's happening is the overhang element comes down a lot further and in general is a little less bulky and a little more flat. So it comes down and abruptly changes plane right in here. And like I just mentioned, its range of influence covers the entire upper eyelid, so it continues all the way down this way. This overhanging piece coming down like this. And we get this rhythmic, graceful, almost like a spline curve contour right here. So when drawing it, what you can often do is start with the epicanthic fold, get the overall shape. Now, remember looking at this model, we can see the upper eyelid coming through here. So I'm going to kind of taper off this line here and then come down again with another indicator as to where the upper eyelid might terminate, somewhere here. The tear duct also is pretty evident, the bottom of the tear duct, I should say. Then we'll just go around for the usual bottom lid, which remains unchanged. Get that thickness in. Get the front planes of the lower lid in there as well. Tucks underneath the upper lid as usual. The plane turning, right around here. One thing I want to correct, I got a little too Caucasian with the curvature of the tear duct area. This is a sharper transition. Kind of goes more like this. That epicanthic fold really cuts through the eye, creating a pretty noticeable angle, something more like this. Now remember earlier on where I measured that horizontal and I said the eye was on an axis, like tilted on an axis. The amount of tilt can change. This person's eyes are tilted more than the eyes we've been looking at before. Now, this is not just an Asian eye thing. This can happen across many different races. But yeah, don't forget to measure that horizontal to see where the crossing point is on this side of the eye. The eyelashes are coming out from underneath the epicanthic fold. For a natural look, I'm just trying to vary the direction and the growth. Same thing with the lower eyelid, just try and vary that. Of course, if you're trying to illustrate someone with heavy makeup or something, you would make it more uniform. Then the iris itself comes in, just nothing much different here at all. Just gonna fill this in messily. On this eye, you can see the pupil a little bit more clearly. It's this darker passage, so I'll fill that in. The epicanthic fold is really casting this into shadow. You can really see it on this particular reference. You can also indicate the thickness of the epicanthic fold with just a little value. Indicating the plane coming down and then turning under. And just for fun, I'll get a lighter value and put it here on the top plane of the lower eyelid. And I haven't put any highlights in any of these eyes yet, which is kind of funny considering that that's the first thing most people go to. But, the eye being a spherical form and being a very wet surface will definitely, catch some reflections from the environment or from the light source. The highlights of the eyes can change dramatically just depending on what's being reflected, how close the camera is. We'll look at those a little more in the painting section, I'm sure. Now you might be wondering about the thickness of the tear duct plane here, but you notice you don't have that clear tear duct shape as you do on a Caucasian eye because that epicanthic fold is so responsible for the contour of the eye that it kind of obscures it. So here we would not have this. Instead, it just kind of, softens out. It's always helpful to draw the cross contours, indicate the flatness of the eye area. Let me just move this diagram over a little bit. This is the overhang plane we've been talking about, but of course it's much different for Asian eyes. And the eyebrow just starts growing along this plane, turning about at this point. Notice I'm changing the direction of my stroke to help the plane turn, but also the direction of the hair growth. Okay, and there we go. Okay, so we have amassed quite a collection of eye drawings here. Unlike previous chapters where I saved the drawing to the end, I've kind of been doing it along the way here. And we're almost done. There's one more little rhythm of the eye that I have not touched on yet that is very important. Let's take a look at it now. The The first thing I have to do is remind you that we have a giant orbit here. This is called the orbit, by the way. I don't think I've mentioned that yet. And we know what's happening all through this half of the orbit. You know that we had the brow terminating here. We had the big overhang area here. The eyeball sat in here. You know, the lower lid came off it here. But we have not yet accounted for this area of the orbit, like the lower orbit. This is a very sharp ridge right here, this bone where the orbit ends and the zygomatic picks up. It's a very sharp ridge. You can feel it right now on your own face. And it, no surprise, creates a rhythm on the head that we really should know. Now, I really want to be clear about this. The lower eyelid does not touch the orbit at the bottom. The lower eyelid sits up here, like in the, somewhere in the lower third of the orbit. This ridge is here. It's lower than the lower eyelid. And there's this thing commonly known as like the bags under the eyes. This thing here, this is the orbit, the bottom of the orbit. Again, I encourage you to feel this area on yourself right now. It kind of comes up around here, wraps around. You can see it on both sides. This is my face, by the way. You can see it on both sides of my face. It's strange, like sometimes when you're tired, this shows up more. I have no idea why. But rhythmically, it echoes the shape, that sort of, downward sort of C shape of the lower eyelid, and, just branches out further. In fact, if you want to draw someone who looks very tired, just give them a lot of bags under the eyes. It's like a cartoony convention. It's not realistic, but it does the job. Anyway, sorry, sidetrack. But going back to the drawing I did earlier, essentially you can start from the point of the tear duct there and just kind of trace it down somewhere down here. This represents the bottom of the orbit. And in theory, it covers the entire circumference of the orbit, but usually you can't see this entire curve. Usually it's just relegated to kind of this first third area. And here it is on another person. I know, very low-res photo, but you can really see the rhythms, right? This is the lower eyelid. Here's that rhythm of the orbit. These two curves kind of mirroring each other. On this side, it's in shadow. It's a little harder to see. Even on photo-retouched, silky smooth Angelina, you can kind of see it. It's there, and it's here. And the reason we can see it is that it's a slight indentation right next to a place on the head where the skin piles up. Do you remember when we were drawing the nose, I had this rhythm coming off the wing of the nose and down, wing of the nose and down, and I called it the laugh lines, or the nasolabial furrow? Well, that rhythm sort of visually mirrors this rhythm. And we have this bulging of flesh here, the cheeks basically. But the flesh piles up there and makes a little mound. And because by contrast the flesh sinks in here, on most people you will see this rhythm. And again, what I like about it is just that. It's rhythmical. They rhyme with each other, these curves. There is a beautiful little design to it. Pretty dramatic in a photo like this where the light is coming from underneath the model because we have that mound of flesh that I talked about. And you can really see where it terminates, right where the orbit is, where that plane abruptly changes as we go into the orbit and then up. Then we have the lower lid just slightly above it. You can see it on this side as well, right? The orbit, the eyelid, the nasolabial furrow. And on the other side, the orbit, the eyelid, the lower eyelid, and the nasolabial furrow, all making this rhythm. This lighting is actually pretty cool to see the scooping action I was talking about before from the brow, how it comes down and then out again, down and then out again. Can you see that? You can see it here too, a plane that kind of is facing up, but then it scoops under and then comes back out to meet the brow. All right, that's a lot of lines I just drew on this guy. And just to wrap up, two quick art examples. We got Anders Zorn on the left and still living artist, great painter Skip Liepke on the right. The lighting situation is very different on both of these. In the Zorn painting, the light's coming from directly above, so it's a shadow pattern, it's a dark pattern. In the Liepke painting, the lighting is a little more flat on, and when that happens, you can often get a bit of a highlight there. We'll save value analysis for part 2 of this whole class, where I actually paint the head. But in closing on this section, just remember that the lower eyelid is one thing, the lower orbit is another thing, and then it nicely kind of rhymes with the nasolabial furrow, which is down here. It's kind of 1, 2, 3 pattern. Again, on this side, 1, 2, 3. All right, that should wrap it up for the eye. Let's now move on to our final chapter in part 1 of this lesson, where we take all the parts we just studied and assemble them.